My name is Daniel Forrester, and I am the man they left at the lighthouse on Longhead Point. I was a marine biologist before any of this. I came out to that quiet stretch of coast on a research grant, counting the things that lived in the cold water and the things that died in it. Longhead Point was a fishing colony on the rim of Sector 12, the kind of place where the fog came in off the sea at 5 in the afternoon and did not lift until the next morning's tide. We had a single road in, a single road out, a wooden church with a bell that hadn't been rung properly in 40 years, and a population of 211 souls, give or take the seasonal cannery crew. By the time the quarantine came down, we were down to 38. By the time I started writing this, I was the last one. I'm setting it all down because the engineer corps will come picking through the ash one day and they'll want a record. They'll want to know what hit us and how we hit back, and they'll want to know it from a man who was there, not from some staff officer reconstructing the timeline from satellite passes and orbital telemetry. So I'm going to tell it straight. Some of it will not flatter us. Some of it will sound impossible. All of it happened. It started with Amos Renner. Amos ran the guest house on the inland side of the harbor. He was 61, a widower, and he had the kind of slow walk that meant he stopped to look at things most men would have stepped over. On the night the first one came down, he was out by the pine line listening to what he thought was a wounded deer. It wasn't a deer. The thing he found in the wet ferns at the edge of his property was about the size of a dinner plate, bone pale, ridged. It moved on 6 articulated bristles tucked under its underside, and when he leaned down to look at it, it screamed. He told me about it the next morning at the cannery dock. Said the scream wasn't a scream the way a gull screamed. Said it was a pitch that made his vision blur for a half second, like a thumb pressed on his eye. He laughed when he said it. By that afternoon the laugh was gone, because by then Amos had a second forehead under his hat, fused along the seam of his own skull, and Amos wasn't really Amos anymore. The thing on top of him took 15 hours to integrate. We didn't know that then. We didn't know any of what I'm going to tell you. We just knew that Amos Renner, who had argued local politics every Tuesday at the diner for 30 years, came in that morning and ordered black coffee and sat for 90 minutes without speaking. And when Millie Healy at the next table told him she was sorry about his late wife's anniversary, he looked at her and said, in a voice that came up from somewhere wrong inside him, "She was meat. Meat ends." Then he stood up, left 2 coins for the coffee, and walked back out into the fog. That was the first day. I remember the rest of that first day in pieces, the way a man remembers the morning of a funeral. I remember Millie Healy at the library counter, sorting returns, asking me if I'd seen Amos and saying he looked peaked. I remember the school teacher, a young woman named Annette Carver, walking her line of children back from the tide pools and stopping to count them twice, the way you count when you can feel something wrong in your spine but haven't put a name to it yet. I remember the gulls that afternoon. There were no gulls that afternoon. I had been on the point 3 years, and I had never known a fog day without gulls, and I sat on the breakwater with a mug going cold in my hand and watched an empty sky for 19 minutes, and the only thing I thought, the only honest thing, was that whatever Amos had brought back from the Pine Ridge had reached the birds first. The second day, 4 more. By the end of the first week, the colony was past saving and nobody on the outside knew yet, because the comm relay tower stood on the bluff right behind Amos's guest house, and Amos had been the man who serviced it. The first thing they did, the things wearing our neighbors, was cut us off, not by breaking the tower, by making it lie. The relay kept singing its little all-clear chirp out into Sector 12 traffic, 211 souls present and accounted for, weather mild, no incidents. While inside the perimeter, they were stacking the dead in the curing room of the cannery and walking the new ones out clean. I want you to understand what they were, because the briefings the Corps put out afterward got the biology wrong, and they got it wrong on purpose, to keep civilians from imagining it. They were not little green men. They were not soldiers. They were not even bodies, not really. What came down in the meteorite stream that hit the Pine Ridge north of town was a colony of crawling cranial plates, sentient bone, is the best I can do, and what each plate wanted more than anything was a host skull to fuse to. They locked onto the front of a human head along the brow ridge, and once they were anchored, they sent a network of fine calcium filaments down into the frontal bone, and from there into the prefrontal cortex of whoever was unlucky enough to be wearing them. The host kept his face, kept his voice, kept enough of his memories to fool his own wife at breakfast. But the part of him that decided things, the part that pulled back from a hot stove or looked twice at a stranger or loved his children, was no longer running the operation. The plate ran the operation, and every plate on every host was in constant low-frequency communion with every other plate in the colony, through a tone we couldn't hear with the conscious ear, but that vibrated in the bone of our own foreheads if we got close enough. That's the part that mattered. That's the part you have to keep in your head as I tell the rest of this. They were a hive. Every one of them knew in real time what every other one of them knew. You couldn't lie to one of them without lying to all of them. You couldn't hide from one of them without hiding from all of them. And every time they took a fresh host, the hive got smarter because they ate the host's experience like a man eats a meal. By the 10th day, they had Chief Bartnett. Bartnett ran what passed for law on the point. He was an older man, ex-fleet security, and he had been the first person I went to when I realized something was wrong. I'd seen Amos at the cannery, and then I'd seen Mrs. Cuddle from the bakery, and I'd seen the Latham boy who worked the gas pump, and all three of them had the same wrongness sitting in their faces, a smoothness, a flatness, like a sketch where the artist had not bothered to fill in the eyes. I told Bartnett what I thought I was seeing. He listened. He took notes. He told me he'd look into it. 2 days later he walked into my lab on the breakwater and shook my hand and asked me, with that same flat smoothness, exactly which of my findings I had committed to written record and exactly who else I had spoken to. I lied to him. I told him I'd kept it all in my head. He nodded and left, and as he left I saw the ridge of bone above his hat brim where there shouldn't have been one, and I knew the law was gone. That night I packed what I could carry and went aground at the lighthouse. The lighthouse stood at the far end of the point, on a finger of basalt that stuck a quarter-mile out into the cold sea. To get to it from the colony you had to cross a causeway that flooded twice a day at high tide. The structure itself was built in the old style, 3 feet of granite at the base, a single iron door, a service room, a generator vault, and the lamp room 93 steps up. It was decommissioned. The shipping lanes had moved 20 years before I got there, and the colony kept it standing only because tearing it down would have cost more than letting it stand. There was no light in it anymore. There were no keepers. There was a working generator, a working radio I would not dare to use, 6 months of canned protein the cannery had stored against a bad winter, and me. The first one I killed with a hammer. It came across the causeway at low tide on the 11th night, walking on a host I had known by face, a young deckhand named Petey Anders, 20 years old, a kid who used to bring me coffee from the diner when I worked late on the cell counts. Petey came up to the iron door and knocked on it politely and called my name in Petey's voice. He said he was hurt. He said he needed help. He said his mother had sent him. I knew it was a lie because Petey's mother had been one of the first taken, and I had seen her at the dock 4 days earlier with the ridge under her scarf, and I knew that the thing on Petey's head knew I had seen her. They were testing me. They were checking to see if I would open the door. I didn't open the door. I climbed up to the lamp room and watched him through the gallery slit. And he stood at that door for 2 hours and 12 minutes without moving, without shifting his weight, without breathing the way a tired boy breathes. Then the tide started to come in, and the plate on his head finally turned his body around and walked him back across the causeway before the water cut him off. The second one came at the next low tide. So did the third. The fourth came in a small boat. By the end of the 2nd week, they had figured out that I wasn't going to open for a voice I knew, and they sent a thing wearing the body of a man I had never met, a cannery worker from the seasonal crew, a stranger with a stranger's accent, and that one came with a pry bar. The second host was Mrs. Cuddle. She had run the bakery on the corner of the Wharf Road for as long as anyone could remember, and she was 81 years old and had a hip that gave her trouble in the cold. The thing wearing her crossed the causeway at 3 in the morning, in a thin housecoat, without a coat or shoes, and I watched her from the lamp room with the binoculars, and I had to put the binoculars down because what I was looking at was an 81-year-old woman with bad hips walking that causeway in a steady, unhurried mechanical gait at a pace she had not been physically capable of for 15 years. She stood at the door for 40 minutes. She did not call out. She did not knock. She waited, the way a thing waits that has been told to wait, and at the first sign of the tide turning she pivoted on her heel and walked back the way she had come, and her body moved like a body that did not know it was tired. I saw her again 4 days later at the dock, in the same housecoat, hosting and hosted, and I understood that the Hive had walked her out to me not because they thought I would open the door for her, but because they wanted to see how long I would watch. The third one was P.D. Anders's mother, Marlene. She came at full daylight, in her clean apron, with a covered basket. I will not describe what she said at the door. I will say only that the Hive had by then learned to imitate grief, and to imitate it well, and that the version of Marlene Anders's voice I heard through the iron of my door that morning was a version that knew exactly which words would put a hook in a man who had once liked her son. I did not open the door. I climbed the 93 steps to the lamp room, and I sat on the floor with my hands over my face for what must have been an hour, and when I came down she was gone, and the covered basket was still on the threshold. There was nothing in the basket. The Hive had not yet figured out that a basket was supposed to contain something. The basket itself was the bait. They were learning props. That was the one I met with the hammer. I won't dress it up. I want you to know what it cost. I was 41 years old, and I had spent my adult life weighing krill specimens on a balance, and the man I killed was wearing the skin of a man who had probably been somebody's son. The plate was anchored over his brow and into his frontal bone, and I could see it poolsing under the skin, very slightly, with the Hive tone. I waited until he had the pry bar between the door and the jamb, and I opened the door an inch, and I brought the hammer down across the ridge of the plate with everything I had in me. The plate cracked. It didn't shatter, that bone was tougher than human bone by an order of magnitude, but it cracked, and the screaming started immediately, that thumb-on-the-eye pitch Amos had described, and the host's body convulsed, and I hit it again and the plate split, and I hit it a third time and the host went down. The body kept moving for about 30 seconds after the plate stopped poolsing. The face, when it finally died, was a stranger's face going through a stranger's grief, an expression I have never been able to scrub out of the back of my mind. I think, and I will never know, that whatever part of him had still been alive inside his own skull came back briefly at the end, just long enough to understand that he was dying, just long enough to be afraid. I dragged the body out onto the basalt and rolled it into the sea. The plate I kept. I needed to know it. This is where the story stops being only about me, and starts being about Millie Healy and Dr. Philip Latham, because the next time I crossed the causeway, I crossed it for them. Millie ran the colony library. She was 68, sharp as a fishhook, and she had been one of the few people on the point who'd looked at me sideways the day I told her, drunk on bad coffee and worse fear, what I thought was happening to her town. She hadn't believed me. She had told me in her library voice that I was overworked, that the air on the point did funny things to a man who spent too many hours alone with a microscope, that I should consider going inland for a few days. But I had seen something move behind her eyes when I said the word forehead, and I had seen her glance at the shelf behind her, and I had marked it, and 3 weeks into the quarantine I went back across the causeway in the dark to find her, because I needed what she knew. She was alive. She had taken her own steps. She was hiding in the basement of the church with Big Dan Frater and the man they called the Swede, Dutch Anacrombie, a hauler off the cargo run who'd had the bad luck to put in at Longhead Point the morning the relay started lying. Frater was a heavy man, 55 or so, weathered like a piling. the kind of cargo sailor who had broken his nose 3 times and never bothered straightening it. The Swede was thin as a length of rope and twice as quiet, and he had a way of standing with his hands resting on the back of a chair that told you he had spent 20 years not getting hit in dockside bars by paying attention to which way doors opened. They had been on the point for 48 hours when the quarantine took hold around them, and they had already killed 2 of the things, one in an alley behind the bakery, one in the back lot of the chapel, and they were trying very hard, when I came down the basement stairs, not to kill me. The basement of that church smelled like damp hymnals and lamp oil. Millie had set up a card table under the only bulb that still worked, and the bulb had been wired through a length of speaker cable to a marine battery the Swede had carried up from his boat. There was a kettle on a camp burner. There was a revolver on the table, an old service piece, and Frater's hand was very close to it when I came down the stairs. I had to talk fast. I had a chunk of cracked plate in my coat pocket, and I put it on the table between us, and Frater looked at it and looked at me and said, in the gravel of a man who had spent 30 years on cargo runs, "All right, lab rat. Talk." I talked. I told them about the brow ridge anchor and the calcium filaments and the hive tone. I told them what I had figured out about integration time, 15 to 20 hours from contact to full takeover, with the window before about hour 6 being the only window in which the host could potentially be saved, and the window after about hour 12 being a window in which the host was already strictly speaking dead. I told them that the thing on Chief Bartnett's head had been wearing Bartnett's voice perfectly well for 10 days now, which meant the hive was learning faster than I'd hoped, which meant we did not have weeks. We had days. Millie listened. When I finished, she put her hands flat on the table and she said, "I have something to show you." She had been reading. This is the part I want the engineer corps to underline twice in their report. While the rest of us had been running and hiding and putting hammers through bone, Millie Healy, 68, librarian, had been reading. She had been pulling every old book off her shelves that mentioned resonance, sympathetic frequency, bone conduction, anything. She had a stack of them on a card table in that basement, with strips of newspaper marking the pages. She had no formal training. She had a library, and she had time, and she had the stubbornness of a woman who refused to accept that the world had gone wrong on her watch. What she had figured out was this. A hive that talked in low-frequency bone resonance was a hive that could be hurt by high-frequency bone resonance. She had no way to prove it. She had no instruments, but she had 3 centuries of folk records about bells driving sickness from villages, and she had a chapter in a salvage manual about ultrasonic descaling, and she had a hunch, and she had been gathering bells. I almost laughed. I am ashamed of that now. I almost laughed in that basement at a 68-year-old woman who had decided to fight an alien hive with church bells. Then Frater, who had not laughed, said, "We tested it. Yesterday, yard of the old chapel." And I said, "One of them came at us." The Swede rang a hand bell about 6 inches off its plate. Thing went down like a stone. Couldn't get up. Plate cracked clean across. I looked at Millie. Millie was not smiling. She said, "I want to be very clear about what we have, Dr. Forrester. We have 1 hand bell, 2 ship's bells off the Swede's boat, and the church bell upstairs, which has not been swung in 40 years and whose rope is rotten. We have a colony of about 170 hosts. The hive knows what we did to the one in the chapel yard, which means by now the hive knows about bells. By tomorrow morning, every one of those hosts will be carrying something in his ears." She was right. The next morning, they came in earplugs. I want to be careful here, because what happened over the next 5 days is the part of this account that the survivors back at Sector Command had the hardest time believing, and I don't blame them. It sounds, when you set it down on paper, like the kind of thing a desperate man invents to make himself feel braver than he was. But Frater was there and the Swede was there, and Millie was there for most of it, and there is a record now, somewhere in the cannery ledger, in Millie's own hand, that says everything I'm about to say. The Hive counted the bells in under 12 hours. By the second sundown after our chapel test, every host on the point was wearing yellow foam plugs they had pulled out of the safety lockers at the cannery. They'd cleaned the lockers out. We'd lost the bells. What we had not lost was the principle. Bone resonance hurt them. The plugs only protected the ear canal. The bone of the skull itself, the skull they were anchored to, was still a tuning fork, and if you could ring that tuning fork hard enough, plug or no plug, the Hive tone in the plate would shatter against its own resonance. You could not do that with a hand bell. You could do it with a percussive blow. I want to be honest about the night I worked this out, because it was the night I stopped being a marine biologist and became whatever the engineer corps decided to call me afterward in the citation papers. The first plate I tested the hammer on was riding a host I had known by name. He was a deckhand off one of the long-line boats, a kid in his middle 20s named Holly's Drew, and the Hive had walked him onto the causeway alone, at low tide, with no pry bar and no basket and no message, just walking, the way a fishing line walks toward a hook, to see what I would do. I let him cross. I opened the door. I told him in a flat voice to come inside and sit down. The thing inside him obliged. The plate believed it had finally cracked the lighthouse, and I think, I can only speculate, that the plate was reporting that small triumph back to the Hive in real time, and that for those 4 minutes the Hive was paying close, satisfied attention to the inside of my service room. I sat him at the table. I gave him a cup of water. He did not drink it. I asked him questions, small ones, easy ones, the kind a doctor asks to gauge whether the patient is tracking. He answered them in Holly's voice, with Holly's small-town vocabulary, almost convincingly. Then I stood up, walked behind him, and brought the hammer down across the front of his skull at full swing. I am not going to describe the next 30 seconds. There are some things a man writes down for the record, and there are some things a man keeps. What I will tell you is what I learned. The plate cracked. The Hive tone in the room cut out, the way a radio cuts out when the antenna goes. And every other host on the point that I could see from the lamp room with the binoculars, and I went up to look, because I had a hypothesis I needed to test. Every host I could see, on every street, for that 90-second window, stood still. The cannery dock crew stopped pushing barrows. The 2 hosts who had been walking patrol along the breakwater stopped walking. Even Sheila Baxter, whom I could just make out moving along the clinic walk, stopped moving and stood with her face slightly tilted, the way a dog tilts its face at a sound it can't place. The Hive had felt it. The whole Hive, all the way across the colony, had felt me kill one of them. By the time I got back down to the service room, the silence in the network was over, and the hosts in the binoculars were moving again, but I had what I needed. I had proof that a focused strike at the right place broke the local link in a way the rest of the Hive could not isolate from. I had proof that the Hive could be hurt at scale. I tested it twice more over the next 2 nights, on plates the Hive sent across to me one at a time. They were still treating me as a containable nuisance rather than a structural problem, and each test refined the geometry. The blow had to land on the plate itself, not the surrounding bone. It had to land flat, not glancing. It had to have weight behind it. A pipe worked. A dead blow mallet I cannibalized from the lighthouse tool locker worked. A claw hammer at full swing worked. What did not work was a knife, a hatchet, or a length of rebar swung edgewise. The plates were too tough, the cracking too dependent on resonance. You needed iron and you needed force, and you needed to land it in one stroke, because once the plate knew it was being attacked, the host was capable of moving faster and harder than the host had been capable of in life. In plain words, what I had found was this. You could not shoot these things off a man's head. You could not pry them off. You could not poison them because they did not eat. But if you hit a host hard enough in the forehead with a piece of iron, the plate killed itself. It killed the host too, most of the time. I am not going to pretend otherwise. The blow that broke the plate broke the man under it. We are not going to talk about that part more than we have to. There is a list in Millie's hand in the cannery ledger of every host we put down by name. It is 41 names long. I want it read aloud every year on the anniversary by somebody who knew them. That is not a request. There were two things, though, that I did not know yet on the night I figured out the hammer. Between that night and the morning Philip walked across my causeway, there was a stretch of about 60 hours that the Corps debrief officers want me to lay out in clean chronological order, and that I find harder to lay out than any other part of this. I will give them what I can. Frater and the Swede made 3 runs back into the colony in those 60 hours. The plan was simple. We needed iron, and we needed it in volume. We needed every length of pipe and every framing hammer and every roofing maul we could pull out of the cannery's tool stores. Because if we were going to make a stand at the launch ground, we were going to need every able pair of human hands on the point armed with a piece of iron that could crack a plate in one stroke. Frater knew the cannery layout from a delivery run he had done 3 years before. The Swede knew how to move along a coastline at night without being seen by anything with eyes that wanted to see him. I stayed with Millie at the lighthouse on those runs, because I was the only one of us who had the lab notes, and Millie was the only one of us with the patience to teach a fishing colony's worth of frightened people, one by one, where to land a hammer blow if it came to it. The first run, Frater and the Swede pulled 42 feet of 1-inch pipe out of the cannery's spare parts yard, along with 16 claw hammers, 4 roofing mauls, and a wooden crate of brass alarm bell, shells the cannery had used in the 50s before the master alarm went in. They lost no time, and they took no fire, and they came home before first light. The second run did not go as well. They got the iron, another 20 hammers, a length of chain, but they came back across the breakwater with a third man, a thin, terrified shopkeeper named Eddie Marsh, who had run a small bar on the wharf road, who had been hiding under his own floorboards for 19 days, and who had not eaten anything heavier than dried fish in a week. Eddie sat in the lamp room and shook and told us things we already knew and a few things we did not. He told us that Nick Vassadine, the small-time hood Sheila Bexter had cut her deal with, was still alive and still himself, holed up with the woman Droxy Chapelle in the back office of the cannery, armed and uninfected, and watching the Hive operate from a window he had not boarded over. Vassadine, Eddie said, had figured out something close to what I had figured out about integration time. Vassadine had figured it out by watching it happen to a man he had personally pushed across a hosting threshold to test it. Vassadine was not a man we wanted on our side. Vassadine was, however, a man who had information we needed. And Vassadine was somebody the Hive had not yet bothered to come for, because the Hive had registered him as a useful supplier and was waiting on a final shipment before it took him. The third run, Frater and the Swede went to the cannery to talk to Vassadine. I want to be plain about what we got and what we paid. Vassadine, sitting in the back office of the cannery with a sawed-off across his knees and a half-bottle of imported gin at his elbow, told Frater the timing of the daily host rotations at the launch ground in the Pine Ridge. He told him the count. He told him that the woman Sheila Bexter was at the launch ground every dawn and every dusk. He told him that there was a Dr. Latham, husband of a hosted wife, who had been seen by Droxy Chapelle 3 days earlier walking on a footpath behind the clinic, alive, alone, and visibly changed about the forehead. He gave us all of this in trade for one thing, a promise that when the Corps fast movers came in to pick up survivors, his name would be on the list. Frater promised. Frater is not a man who lies about a promise. Vassadine's name went on the list. By the time the list mattered, Vassadine and Droxy had both been hosted at the cannery by a 4-host strike team the Hive sent in on the morning of the 4th day, and the list did not mean anything for either of them, and Frater, who I have not seen take a drink since, took that one personally. The first thing I did not know yet was Dr. Philip Latham. Philip had been one of 2 doctors on the point. He was a quiet man in his early 50s, soft-spoken, married to a kind woman named Mary, the kind of physician who had treated 3 generations of fishermen for the same kinds of cuts and the same kinds of grief. When the quarantine started, he had been working alongside a colleague of his named Sheila Baxter on something Sheila called, with the deadly seriousness of a person who had stopped sleeping a long time before the rest of us, foreheadazing. I want to be plain about Dr. Baxter, because the official record is going to be kinder to her than I am. Sheila Baxter had a theory, before any of this started, that the human frontal bone was not merely structural, that the bone itself in living tissue played a role in cognition we had badly underestimated. It was a fringe theory. She had been laughed out of 2 universities for it. She had retreated to the point to keep working in peace. When the plates came down, she did not see a horror. She saw a confirmation. She saw a hive of organisms that had clearly evolved to exploit exactly the cognitive skeletal interface she had spent her career insisting was real. And in the 3rd week of the quarantine, before any of us understood what we were looking at, Sheila Baxter struck a deal with a small-time hood named Nick Vassadine and his girlfriend, a woman called Droxy Chapelle, to procure her additional specimens for what she insisted on calling her research. She experimented on Philip. She used the cadavers off Big Dan Freighter's hold. The cargo freighter had hauled into Longhead Point 3 days before the relay started lying. 2 crates of donor remains on their way to a teaching hospital inland, and she extracted from the plates of 3 crawling foreheads that had not yet found hosts a compound she synthesized into an injectable. She told Philip it would protect him. She told him it would inoculate him. She told him a number of things that were partly true and mostly not, and Philip, who loved her in the quiet, doomed way that older men in small towns sometimes love women who do not love them back, took the injection. The injection did not protect him. It did something far stranger. It made the bone of his forehead grow. By the time we found him, on the 4th day of the Bell phase, locked in the back room of Sheila's clinic, his frontal bone had thickened to nearly twice its normal depth, and the skin over it was stretched tight and shining, and the man underneath was still in there, still Philip, still recognizable, still capable of speech, but with a forehead so heavy and so ridged that when the hive saw him through the eyes of its hosts, the hive thought he was one of them. They walked past him. They opened doors for him. They believed. That was the second thing I did not know. The hive recognized its own by sight. We learned this on the morning Philip came across the causeway under his own power, with Sheila's last hypodermic in his coat pocket and a half-burned ledger under his arm, and rang the iron handle of my lighthouse door 3 times in the old code and said, in his own voice, "Daniel, let me in. I have 10 hours." I let him in. He told me what Sheila had done. He told me what he had become. He told me, in the cool, regretful voice of a country doctor explaining a terminal diagnosis, that the compound was burning through him, that his skull was still thickening, that within roughly 10 hours he expected the growth to compress his brain against the back of the cranial vault and kill him. He was not panicked about this. He had the look of a man who had already grieved himself. But he had used the time he had. He had walked through the colony for 2 days with his new face, while every host on the point treated him as kin. He had stood in the cannery while the plates discussed, in the slow, flat speech they used when they thought no humans were listening, the plan. He had heard the plan. He had written the plan down. He had brought me the plan. The plan was a ship. The plates had not come down in one meteorite. They had come down in a stream of them, fragments of a larger craft they had ridden in on, and in the Pine Ridge north of town, there was the largest of those fragments, a piece of hull about the size of a fishing trawler, half buried, intact enough that the plates believed they could repair it. They had been harvesting the colony not for sport but for hands. They needed bodies to do the work that bone plates on bristled legs could not do alone. They were rebuilding the craft. In 96 hours, by Philip's count, they intended to launch it, not to flee, to breed. The plan was to lift off the point with a seed colony of roughly 200 mated plates, ride atmospheric currents to the nearest continental landmass, and begin the process of conversion across populated cities, where instead of 211 souls they would have 200 million. If they made the launch, the human species had perhaps 18 months. If we stopped the launch, we stopped it on Longhead Point, or we did not stop it at all. We had Philip's 10 hours. We had the bell principle. We had the hammer principle. We had 4 of us, Frater, the Swede, Millie, me, with Philip dying on his feet beside us, against a hive of roughly 160 active hosts, all of whom now wore earplugs, all of whom now knew our faces, and all of whom were converging on a half-buried alien hull in a pine ridge 2 miles inland from my lighthouse. I want to tell you we had a clever plan. We didn't. What we had was Philip's body, the cannery's fire alarm system, and the willingness to use both. Philip explained it sitting at my service room table, with his enormous wrong forehead lowered and his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee he could no longer taste. He spoke to Millie more than to me, because Millie was the one who would have to carry the rest of it. He said, the alarm system at the cannery was a legacy industrial unit, mechanical bell, 3-inch brass dome, designed to be heard over the noise of the line. It had been wired into the colony's public address grid in the 60s, every speaker on every pole, every horn on every dock. If somebody pulled the master handle, the whole point rang, every street, every building, every pine in the ridge. It was, he said, the largest bell in the world that we had access to. Bells hurt them. But not enough, not at distance. The hive had countermeasured the bells, and a master alarm at distance would only inconvenience them. To kill a plate, you needed resonance through the host's skull. To get resonance through every host's skull at once, you needed every host to be close to the source. You needed them gathered. The plates were gathering. In 96 hours they would be gathered around the half-buried hull, all of them at once, performing whatever the hive's version of a launch ceremony was. If, at the moment of maximum density, somebody pulled the master alarm, and if, at the moment of maximum density, the brass bell at the cannery were itself resonating against the frontal bone of a host with abnormal cranial density, a host the hive had accepted as kin, a host who could walk among them carrying the bell. Philip would walk. He would carry the cannery bell on his back. He would walk it into the middle of the launch gathering. At the moment of maximum density, he would pull his own alarm cord. The cannery bell would ring against his own monstrous forehead at point-blank range. The resonance would travel through his skull, through the hive tone he was now half-tuned to from the forehead-azine, and outward through the gathered network. He estimated, he could not be sure, but he estimated that the feedback wave through 160 interlocked plates at that range would crack every plate at the site. It would also crack his skull. He knew this. He had known it before he came across the causeway. He said this without drama, the way a country doctor would say it. He said, "Daniel, my wife is at the cannery. They have her. I have seen her. She has been hosted for 19 days. Mary is not coming back. I would like the work I do tonight to mean she does not come back to a world they finished." Then he drank his coffee and looked at Millie and said, "If you would help me carry the bell, I would be obliged. It is heavier than I am." We helped him carry the bell. I want to skip ahead to the launch ground, because the hours before it are a blur in my memory, and I have written them down elsewhere, and the engineer corps can have those notes if they want them. What I want to put on this page, where it can be found, is what happened at the Pine Ridge. The hull was bigger than Philip had said. It rose out of the wet ferns like the keel of a wrecked ship, dull gray, ridged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, and the plates and the hosts were arrayed around it in concentric rings, the way bees arrange around a queen. There were more than 160. I counted to 200 and stopped counting. Chief Bartnett was there. Amos Renner was there. Mary Latham was there in her good Sunday coat, with the ridge of the plate visible above her brow line and her eyes as flat and empty as river stones. Sheila Bexter was there. She had been hosted at some point in the last 48 hours, and the plate she carried was a large one, and the hive was treating her, I think, as something close to an officer. We came up through the pines from the west, the 4 of us alive and Philip walking ahead. Frater and the Swede had the bell on a litter between them, draped in canvas to muffle it until the moment. Millie carried the alarm pole, a length of corded rope spliced to the master handle Philip had walked out of the cannery the night before. I had a hammer. I had the cracked plate from my coat pocket, the very first one, sealed in a tin, in case any of us got out and any of us needed proof. The walk-in took us 40 minutes. The pines along that ridge grow close enough together that two men cannot walk abreast, and the floor is a wet mat of last year's needles that holds a footprint and gives up no sound, and we used that. Frater led. The Swede walked rear guard with a roofing maul across his shoulders and his free hand on Millie's elbow, because Millie was 68 and the ground was bad and she would not have asked to be steadied. I walked second behind Philip, close enough that I could put a hand on his back if his legs began to give. They were going to give. We all knew they were going to give. The compound burning through him had reached a point where the skin over his swollen brow had begun to weep a clear fluid, and his breathing came in 2-count pulls, and somewhere between the lighthouse and the launch ground, he stopped sweating, and I knew from a year of pre-med 20 years before what that meant about his body's temperature regulation, and I did not say anything to him about it because he already knew. Halfway in, where the trail turned past a stand of dead birch, he stopped and put one hand on a trunk and looked at me, and I thought he was going to ask for water, and what he said instead was, "If Mary speaks after, if she comes back enough to speak, tell her I was sorry about the dog." Then he walked on. I did not ask what dog. He did not say. There are pieces of other men's lives a man carries past the end of the war without ever knowing what they were for. We stopped at the tree line. The hosts did not turn. The plates did not turn. They had accepted Philip's silhouette, and they had not yet registered the 4 shadows behind him. Philip looked back at us once. He did not say anything. He had said it all in the lighthouse service room over coffee. He simply looked back and nodded, and the part of his face that had been Philip Latham, the country doctor, the husband, the man who had set 100 broken arms, was still there, behind the wrongness of his brow, looking out at us like a man waving from the back of a moving train. Then he turned, and he walked alone into the rings of the hive. The plates parted for him. Hosts moved aside. He walked past Chief Bartnett. He walked past Amos. He walked past his own wife, and his wife did not see him. He walked all the way to the inner ring where the hull cracked open in a kind of vented seam, and he stopped beside Dr. Sheila Bexter, who looked up at him, and with the plate riding her, smiled the kind of smile that had nothing in it. Then Philip raised one hand to us where we stood in the trees, and the hand was the signal. Frater and the Swede pulled the canvas off the bell. I struck the bell with the hammer. Even at the tree line at 50 yards, the first ring of it staggered the outer hosts. 3 of them dropped. I struck it again. 6 more dropped. The hive saw us then. Every face in the gathering turned at the same instant, and every plate began to scream that thumb-on-the-eye scream, and the air between us went thick with that pitch, and the pines along the ridge shivered. Millie pulled the cord. The master alarm at the cannery, 2 miles south on the dockside, fired. Every horn on every pole on every street of the point fired with it, and the launch ground filled with the brass of a colony-wide bell, but at distance, blunted, not enough. Philip pulled his own cord, the second one, the small one wired to the canister he had carried on his back. The compact bell strapped against his shoulder swung once, hard, and struck the swollen ridge of his own forehead. I do not have the words for what happened next. I will try anyway. The resonance went through Philip's skull, and through the plate tone of the hive at the launch ground, and through every host in every ring at once. For half a second the air looked like water, the way air looks over a hot road, and then every plate on every host within the perimeter cracked, all at once, with a sound like a sheet of ice giving way under a man's weight, and every host within the perimeter went down at the same moment, with the same expression, and the screaming stopped. All of them. The hosts did not die. That is the thing I want very badly for the record to show. Most of the hosts did not die. The plates died. The plates broke. The filaments through the frontal bone retracted, the way a tide retracts off a beach. The hosts, when they came back to themselves, came back to bodies that had been ridden hard for weeks, and many of them did not survive the shock, and many of them did not survive the next 48 hours. But Mary Latham opened her eyes that morning in the wet ferns next to the half-buried hull, and she said her own name in her own voice, and that was Philip's doing, and the record needs to say so. Philip himself was not alive when we reached him. The cannery bell at point-blank range had done what he expected it to do. His skull, already strained past anything human bone was meant to bear, had given way under the resonance of the strike. He was lying on his side in the ferns, near Sheila, with his eyes closed, and the swollen forehead was still, and the wrongness was gone, and what was left was a country doctor in his early 50s who had spent his last 10 hours walking across his hometown carrying a bell. I knelt in the ferns and I closed his good hand around the alarm cord, because it was his alarm. It seemed right to leave him holding it. We carried what we could. The hosts who could walk, we walked. The hosts who couldn't, we carried on canvas. Freighter and the Swede made 12 trips between the launch ground and the breakwater that morning. Millie tended the worst of them at the lighthouse, in the service room, with a kettle and the same brisk firmness she had used to run her library for 40 years. By noon, the relay tower came back under our hands. By 2 o'clock, the quarantine call went out, this time to Sector Command, and by sundown the first of the Corps fast movers was overhead. There is, the Corps tells me, a single plate unaccounted for. When they swept the launch ground 3 days later, the count of cracked plates came up 1 short. The hull itself was empty when they cut it open, no remaining mated pairs, no live specimens, no eggs by whatever the Hive's term for eggs had been. But 1 plate had not been at the gathering, somewhere on the point, or in the pine ridge, or out under the wet ferns where we could not look. One of them was still moving. The Corps tells me this is a containment problem, not a strategic one. The Corps tells me with the calm of staff officers that a single plate without a host is a slug under a log, that it cannot reproduce, that it cannot signal anything farther than the radius of its own dying tone, that it will be found and dealt with in due course. The Corps may be right. The Corps was wrong about a lot of other things, but the Corps may be right about this. I am not so sure. I sit, most evenings now, at the top of the lighthouse in the lamp room, looking south across the causeway toward the colony. The fog comes in at 5. The relay tower sings its real song again, the truthful one, and the road in and the road out are open, and the cannery has been torn down because no one could bear to use that building again, and there are 19 people living on the point this winter where there used to be 211. The bell from the launch ground sits in the corner of the lamp room. It is a brass dome, 3 inches across, and I have it close at hand, because I am not yet ready to put it somewhere I cannot reach it in the dark. The Corps would like me to come inland. The Corps has, in fact, sent me 3 formal letters, each one a little firmer than the last, requesting my presence at a debrief I keep postponing. They want my notes. They want my voice on the record. They want, I think, to put me in a room with younger men and let them ask me the questions they have not had the experience to ask of anyone else. I will go eventually, not yet. I stay because of Philip, and because of Millie, and because of 41 names in a cannery ledger. I stay because the man I killed with a hammer at my own iron door had a mother somewhere who deserves to know what she lost and how. I stay because somewhere out there, somewhere in the wet ferns, a single bone-pale thing the size of a dinner plate is dragging itself on 6 articulated bristles toward whatever scrap of host it can find, and on the night it finds one I want to be on the point and not inland. I stay because we won, and I do not entirely trust the word. I stay because the lighthouse is mine now, and because the dark out there is honest in a way the dark inland is not. People ask me, the few who come out and the fewer who stay long enough to ask, how it was we beat them. They expect a story about weapons. They expect a story about a clever stratagem hatched at a war table. I tell them the truth. I tell them that we beat them because a 68-year-old librarian read every book on her own shelves, because 2 cargo sailors who had been on the point for 48 hours stayed instead of running, because a country doctor in his early 50s chose to walk 2 miles through a town that no longer recognized him, carrying a bell that would kill him. I tell them we beat them because the Hive could lie to us and copy us and ride us, but it could not understand a thing about us that we sometimes barely understand ourselves. The Hive thought a man would not break his own skull to spite it. The Hive was wrong. I am Daniel Forrester. I am the man they left at the lighthouse on Longhead Point. The fog comes in at 5. The bell is in the corner of the lamp room, and every now and then on a clear night I take it down and I hold it in my lap and I do not ring it. I just hold it. And I listen, the way Amos Renner once listened in the wet ferns at the edge of his property for the sound of something coming up out of the dark. So far I have not heard it. So far,